All right, guys, this week we are going to have a short lecture, but it's going to be beneficial because it's kind of taking what we've talked about and then setting up what we're going to be talking about as we move forward in the class. Now, some of these elements you may have heard before, especially in high school English, but it's essential that we kind of go over them to get ready to talk about what we're going to dive into in the next couple of weeks. So, this week we're going to talk about the Storyteller's Toolbox. And to start out with, I want to show you a short video from um, a YouTube series called Pixar's Box. And we all know Pixar, who is a company with Disney, and they have the great ability to tell stories, especially with visuals. And so this is kind of the onset of a long series that they did talking about different things that go into storytelling, but it sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today.
Hey, Pete.
Oh, hey, Val.
How's it going?
You know what? I'm having a really bad day.
What happened?
See, what Val's saying when she says, what happened is, tell me a story. And that's actually what this season of Pixar in a Box is all about. To make a movie here at Pixar takes years, but it all starts with a story. Humans have been telling stories since we could speak, probably even before. We tell stories around the campfire. We write plays, we write novels, short stories, we make movies, we take photographs, tweet to each other, the list goes on. The power of story is that it has an ability to connect with people on an emotional level. One of the things you hear all the time, this advice, is write what you know. Now, as a kid, I was like, I don't want to write about suburban Minnesota. That's boring. I want to write about explosions and monsters and car chases. Well, what that actually means is, yeah, go ahead and write about monsters and explosions and car chases, but put something into it that talks about your own life, how you feel. Do you feel scared? Do you feel alone? Something from your own life will make that story come alive and not just be a boring car chase. When I started directing Monsters Incorporated, the way I would pitch it is, it's about a monster who scares kids for a living. That's his job. He clocks in, he clocks out, he eats donuts and talks about union dues, and we thought that was a pretty funny idea. And sure enough, when I would tell it to people, they would smile. But when we told the story as a film, people started getting bored and restless, and they're like, I don't understand what this movie's about. Well, what I finally figured out was that it's actually not about a monster who scares kids. It's about a man becoming a father. And that was what was happening to me. So why write about what you know? Well, it's because probably what happened to you made you feel some particular way. And what you're trying to do really when you tell a story is to get the audience to have that same feeling. One of the big revelations for me telling stories is how much work they are, really. I always thought you'd just tell the story once and it would be perfect, and geniuses like Walt Disney or Miyazaki, this brilliance comes out of their head once and there it is. Well, the truth is, our stories don't always come out exactly perfectly the first time, or the second time, or the third time, or the fourth time, up to the 30th time. And so you keep going again and again and again, and only after retelling the story many, many times does it really sparkle. This season of Pixar in a Box is about how we at Pixar tell our stories, in hopes that it will inspire you to tell yours.
But seriously, what happened?
So the first thing, I get to my desk, right? It's 8 o'clock in the morning.
So, the main focus of this week is just talking about story. How do we get story? Previously, we've talked about composition, we've talked about lighting, we've talked about the psychology of color, and all of these things play into the idea of how you tell a story and how you can tell it better. But one thing we haven't really talked about is the structure of a story and the tools that go into that. And even though this is really for writing and, for authors, this idea, it still goes into visual storytelling because in many cases, whether it's photography, design, or photography or videography, we talk about the same ideas of story structure and how to get from one into another. And so when you think about story and how you tell a story, there is a structure. And usually it begins with the opening or the exposition. And that's really just setting up what's going to happen, introducing your characters. And then something happens, the inciting incident. This is where we get the drama, we get the conflict. You have to have something that happens in your story, right? Otherwise, we just have a happily ever after. And although that's great, they're kind of boring. From there, we start getting what's called the rising action or the crisis. And this is where everything builds up. This is the hero's journey, which is one type of structure for a story. There are several different ones. It's ones that is used often. But once they start rising and we are getting the conflict and things are building up, we get to the climax. And this is usually like where we see the big fight or we see the hero come to some kind of conclusion about what's going on. Then we get the falling action, and this is where things start to slow down. We see where the fight ends. We see the bad guy get picked up. We see the girl fall in love with the hero or vice versa. And then we get what is called the resolution. And then this is where you get the happily ever after. They lived forever happy. The next story begins, those kinds of things. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, you've probably seen it like this. This is the basic plot structure of any story. And then you start getting different types of story structures that take this basic format and they add different things to it. And we're not going to get into all of the different types of plot structures this week or really in this class, but just know that there are several different types that can change the outcome of a story. But generally, this is how it goes. If you're still having trouble thinking about, well, how does this work with a finished story? Think about it in the Hunger Games. So the Hunger Games, whether you like the book or the movie, is a popular story that has resonated the last couple of decades. And we get the exposition or the setup with the idea that Katniss is from a poor family. They really struggle with what's going on. They've lost her dad. And then we get to the idea of inciting incidents. And this is where we are introduced to what the Hunger Games are. We get to the scene where she volunteers to tribute for her sister. Then we go in and you think, okay, things couldn't get any worse, but they do. She enters the games. We get the idea of may the odds be ever in your favor. So not only is the game the first struggle, but then she has to actually get into it. The second idea and the climax is, we get the rising action is that she's in the game, she trained for them. And then we get to the climax. She is there, we're going to, win. And then they're like, there's going to be 2 survivors. Okay, so she doesn't have to kill PETA. There's hope. We can both go home, right? She doesn't have to feel like this terrible person for killing someone that's become her friend. And then we get to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, never mind. Now that there's 2 of you, one of you has to die. And she introduces the berries and she's like, no, we're both going to die, right? And from there we get the resolution and the epilogue. And this really builds into the fact that she tricks the Capitol. And from there, what's going to happen? And we get into Catching Fire and Mockingjay. So this gives you kind of an idea of how this plays out into a finished story. So we have this story structure. We have the idea of like how a story is supposed to be put together. But how do you tell a good story? I mean, you can have all these elements, but just because you have them doesn't mean that you tell it in a way that is compelling. And we see that a lot with failed television shows, with movies that don't do so well, maybe books that you just do not finish. And so NPR came up with this idea, and this is really for developing new stories, but it carries on to any type of story that you're going to tell, whether it be a novel, a film, a photo essay, any of those things. And basically, the first idea is that you want to understand the story is more than just a scene or an anecdote. The story is a whole, right? It's a whole pie. And you can take pieces of the pie out and change them and rearrange them, but the story as a whole needs to be put together. The second idea is that you want to tell a meaningful story. Have you ever just had somebody tell you a story and you're like, okay, so what? Why do I care about this? And from the video about Pixar, he started telling that too. Like, we had this idea for Monsters Inc. These monsters are scaring kids and they have like this union and they go to work every day. And, that's kind of funny, right? Because it's what we as humans do. But what really made it a meaningful story was the fact that at the time in his life, he had become a father, and he kind of translated that into, it's not just about scaring kids, it's about taking care of kids and finding another way to create this power source, right? And so he selected a meaningful story, changed it up a little bit, and created a whole plot structure for that. Now, once you get the idea for the meaningful story, you start developing it, you figure out the structure, and then you go through and you change it and you work with it until you feel like you have a story that really resonates with other people. And that's when he talked about, he thought growing up when he wanted to become this storyteller that he could be like Walt Disney and it just happened, right? Like the magic is just there from the beginning. But even with Walt Disney, he has always said in interviews and different documentaries that have been done about him that you have to keep changing, you have to keep progressing, and it's not just a one hit thing, right? They take the story and they really develop it, and they look at how they can really make an impact with their audience with it. And so here are just a few things when you're thinking about a story, um, or whether you're thinking about writing one, putting one together, doing your project, or just when you're looking at how a story is developed that you're watching or reading, these are things that you need to think about. And this is how you tell a good story. Now, sometimes you might go, well, how do I even find a good story, right? My life is boring. I don't know, any good idea. I don't have any good ideas. I have no creative juices. That's wrong. You do. Sometimes you just have to kind of dig a little deeper. So here are some prompts that maybe you can use if you're coming up with a project, if you're coming up with some kind of idea for a story, or if you're trying to think like, what is the purpose of a story I'm reading or watching? So one of those is, if your life were a movie, what scene would you never forget? What is something that resonates in your life that you will never forget, that you can picture every detail from? We all have one of those moments, and maybe that is worth telling. Then you have, what's something someone said to you that you'll never forget? And that's also something that resonates with you, right? It may not resonate with everybody, but maybe it resonates with you enough that you could tell a story about it. Another idea is to tell about a breakthrough moment. What is a time that you had an adversary, you had a conflict, or you had something that you came over, or you had a breakthrough moment of, oh my gosh, I can do this, or I thought of this idea that could produce something. Tell us about a time you had to follow your heart, right? We all are a sucker for romance, whether you think about it or not. And it doesn't even have to be a romantic notion. It could be something like Hercules, right? Where he has a breakthrough moment of he's going to become a hero, and he followed his heart to do that. And then tell us about a moment you were reunited with something you treasure. And so that's another thing. It's really just taking this idea of, okay, what is something that really resonates with me, something that really impacted me, and how can I tell that in story form, whether it be visual or written? Now, here are some tips on how to take this story idea. You've got the story structure, you've got the idea. How do you make it better when you are trying to put it all together for an audience? Or even if you're critiquing a good story. One is to be authentic, or is it authentic? Do you feel like this could resonate with you, or does it resonate with you? Knowing your audience. This is a big thing, not only with storytelling, but just in, any type of media, especially if you're going to continue in the College of Media and Communication. You are going to be told, know your audience, know your audience, know who your audience is, who's your target audience. And this just will continue to be something you have to think about, right? Because if you don't have an audience, or if you don't connect with your audience, then your story or your product or your ad or whatever is just going to fail. For visuals, sometimes you need to think like a writer. Think about how they would describe something, how you would picture it in a book, or, describe it in a paragraph, because then you can take that idea and you can transcribe it and transport it into a visual element. Of course, you want to borrow from visual language of cinema and photography, and we've talked a little bit about that with some compositional things earlier on in the semester, and we're going to continue talking about them and how you apply them in meaningful ways. You also want to think about showing and not just telling. This goes back to thinking like a writer, right? You don't just tell them, you show them, you describe it, and you can do that visually, of course, but the way that you show them can be impactful. And we talked a lot about that with composition. Then you want to choose visuals that connect with your audience. If I want to tell the story about a loving dog, just showing the dog is one thing, but showing the dog with their human, or them playing fetch, or even like saving them, these kinds of visuals really connect with an audience, right? It's not just about, oh, that's a cute dog. It's about the connection it has with its owner. And then finally, you want to be able to quickly and consistently provide engaging visuals. It's not just about providing some kind of visual for your story, but how can you do it in a way that's consistent and quick, right? We have the shortest attention span ever. And a lot of that has to do with social media, right? Because it's a tool of addiction. We want to hit that dopamine over and over and again. And so that's why TikTok is really popular, because it's short videos that you can consume quickly. And so you want to be able to do this quickly and consistently. When you're thinking about how to visually tell your story, here are some tools that you can use to do that. Now, of course, you can have a camera, you can use your artistic ability to draw, to etch, to color. You can take pictures, you can, create videos, any of those kinds of things. But here are some things that, some platforms that you can use to better do that. Adobe Creative Cloud, of course, is one. It's the professional set of tools that we use, that's like Photoshop, Lightroom, Adobe Premiere, Adobe After Effects. This is expensive. It's also somewhat complicated to use if you don't know where to start. But it is the professional standard. But then you can get into things like Canva, which is an easier tool. It can be free, or you can pay for a premium version, and it just allows you to start kind of designing and putting together not only digital creations, but you can print those things, you can post them. Procreate is another one that you can use on your laptop to, if you're more of an artistic person that likes to draw or paint. We also have what's called Infogram, and this is just taking a lot of data and making it visual into infographics. You have Loop, which is a platform that allows you to take pictures or video and create montages of them. You have Uber Flip, which can make flip charts, flip books, different things like that. Word Art takes a bunch of typography and words and puts them together into visuals. And then, of course, social media. You have Instagram, you have TikTok, you have Facebook, Twitter. All of these different areas allow you to visually put media out into the world. And then there's also tools that go with that. And any of the tools mentioned above can also help put your skills to the medium, as you could say, in social media. So as you start thinking about your projects, as you start thinking about where you want to go with your major, with a career, whether it be in media or not, these are things that you want to think about. And so as we continue into the semester, these are some things that we're going to start talking about a little more in depth. Well, we've talked about composition and lighting, but we're going to start putting them into more concrete ideas instead of just the abstract. And we're going to start showing more examples of how they work, especially when we talk about different types of camera shots and angles, and then different types of camera movements and why all of these things create visuals that make us feel certain ways. We're also going to talk about transitions and storyboarding and how you need to create your story in a way that flows and makes sense. And then, of course, we will add music into that. How does music take your visuals to a new level? How does it create even more feeling and an aesthetic to it? But also, how does silence create things? With that, we're going to be looking at, more photography, how film plays into it, graphic novels, video games, advertisement. We're going to really dwell and dive into those different elements and how all of these things go into creating visual stories. So keep all of this in mind as we move forward and how it kind of builds on top of one thing or another to really create a dynamic visual story.